I'll let you know as soon as we're ready to go.
All right.
All right. Are you ready?
Ready.
I'm going to start the webinar.
Hello. My name is Tim Lee. I teach church history and direct Asian American Pacific Islander church studies at Brite. Thank you for taking the time to be part of this year's AAPICS Colloquy, now in its 14th year. The Colloquy, as usual, centers on a panel featuring an invited speaker and a set of respondents, all engaging with the work, an already published article or a paper that's a work in progress provided by the speaker. We have an excellent panel today, but before I introduce the panelists, let me briefly go over the order of the colloquy. After my brief introduction, our speaker, Reverend Shanda Rani Zhang, will summarize for us the paper she has provided for the colloquy. The paper is titled Honoring Christ, Honoring Ancestors, Honoring Self, Challenges to the Asian Community in Navigating Culture and Christ through the lens of connecting with the spiritual wisdom of our ancestors. She will be followed by presentations by our respondents. The first respondent will be Dr. Andy Mangum, followed by Dr. David Chung, and then Dr. Tomi Oredein. Then Reverend Zhang will have an opportunity to respond to the respondents. Afterward, we should have about 10 minutes or so for open conversation. Since this is a webinar, those of us in the audience will be able to participate only by messaging. So I invite you to send your comments and questions throughout the colloquy using the Q&A function on your screen. And during open discussion, I'll read as many of them as possible for us and for the panelists to respond. One more procedural note. Each panelist has 10 minutes for their presentation, including Reverend Zhang for her summary, though she has only 5 minutes for her responses to the respondents. So in order to be efficient with our time, I'll serve as a timekeeper, and I have here a little timer that I will set at 8-minute mark. So when it beeps, it just means that a presenter has 2 minutes to wrap up the presentation. I now have the privilege of introducing our excellent panel. All the introductions, I'm afraid, will have to be brief given the time constraints. Let me begin with the respondents. The first respondent is Dr. Andy Mangum, and Dr. Mangum earned a Doctor of Ministry degree from Austin Theological Seminary and an MD degree from Brite Divinity School. He serves as the regional minister of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in the Southwest. He is followed by Dr. Andy Zhou. Dr. Zhou is visiting assistant professor of pastoral theology and care and Louisville Institute postdoctoral fellow at Brite. He holds a PhD and an MD from Emory University and is an ordained minister of the Presbyterian Church USA. And our third respondent is Dr. Tomi Oredein. Dr. Oredein is assistant professor in Black religious studies, constructive theology, and ethics at Brite. She is also director of the Brite's Black Church Studies program. Dr. Oredein earned an MDiv and a THD at Duke University and is a ruling elder of the Presbyterian Church USA. Now let me introduce our speaker. An ordained disciples minister, Reverend Shanda Rani Zhang, earned a Master of Divinity and Master of Public Policy from the University of Chicago Divinity School. She is the founding director of the Oakland Peace Center, which is a collective of 40 or so organizations working to create equity, access, and dignity as the means of creating peace in the Bay Area. She is the author of several books, including Pre-Post-Racial America, Spiritual Stories from the Front Lines, which was published in 2015, and Liberating Love Daily Devotional, 365 Love Notes from God, which was published last year, both by Chalice Press. Raised in an interracial and multi-faith family, Reverend Zhang has been a prominent leader of pro-reconciliation and anti-racism ministries of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. Now, Reverend Zhang, thank you again for being with us, and may I ask you to give us a summary of your paper?
Absolutely. I am so grateful to get to be a part of this. Many of the people who have presented in the past are mentors of mine, and so much of the work that I do is focused on anti-racism in a multicultural context, that it was a real gift to get to focus specifically on the Asian American context, and I'm so grateful for that opportunity. The paper I wrote was related to a project I'm working on this year. My upcoming book is on how connecting with the spiritual and cultural practices of our ancestors can equip us for the work of dismantling white supremacy. So that's what drove this particular paper. And I think there are some very specific issues that Asians in the United States and Asian Americans face when we are coming out of a Christian context that raises particular challenges in engaging with the work of connecting with our ancestors. I mention that because, as I point out in the paper, very often the experience that Asians in Asia receive regarding our connection with Christianity comes through a white, Western, often US missionary lens. And the version of Christianity that has been offered to our forebears has been a version of Christianity specifically shaped by Euro-American values. This matters because despite the fact that Asian is kind of a construct, Asian isn't really a racial grouping. We don't necessarily share specific DNA in common between India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, China, Vietnam, the Philippines, Korea, and so forth. Despite that, we do share across diverse religions and cultures an understanding of the wisdom of our elders and of our ancestors. That's not necessarily a religious value so much as a cultural value. And so that has, over many generations, collided with a particular version of Christianity we've been given. And in the process, the version of Christianity we've been given has been conflated with whiteness in ways that I think limit our capacity to bring the rich cultural gifts we bring to a Christianity that was in fact shaped in what could be described as a connection point for the continent of Africa and also of Asia, and that you can see those cultures show up in the very origins of our faith tradition. So I want to be clear that there are specific issues that white American Christians might engage when wrestling with this issue of connecting with ancestors, that there are specific issues that my Latinx and my African American friends wrestle with. And the purpose of this project is specifically to look at the Asian American and Asians in the United States Christian challenges. I think one of the things that is worth us sitting with in this colloquy is what are the gifts our ancestors have to offer us in the midst of our experience of marginalization, as immigrants or children of immigrants, as people whose racial categorization in this land has deemed us to be perpetual foreigners, no matter how long we've been here. I think there's an opportunity for us to look at the stories of our ancestors also surviving experiences of marginalization. There are opportunities for us to connect with the stories of Asian Americans in this land who have survived marginalization. And when we are told that Christianity disallows us from connecting with our ancestors because it gets confused with ancestor worship, that robs us of the tools and gifts that our ancestors left for us to survive this context. Now, I understand that sometimes the discussion of anti-Asian racism tends to get dismissed. And I think we're in a particular moment right now for a number of heartbreaking reasons where that is harder to ignore. The reality of anti-Asian racism predates any of us who are in this call and actually goes all the way back to the founding of this country. As we unearth more and more of the history of our nation, even going back to the earliest days of, say, the Jamestown colony, there were enslaved people from India in the Jamestown colony. As what was to become the United States was experimenting with how to create a construct of race that would serve the people with the most resources, we were tools in that experiment. And that's part of the story that doesn't always get told. And if it did get told, it might allow us to connect with our allies in the struggle. Part of the reason Indian enslaved people did not continue to be a part of the American story is we were able to and allowed to blend in with Native Americans. We were hard to catch because Indigenous people helped us survive. Similarly, there is a lot of discussion these days about what we call critical race theory. And there is actually recently an academic article that was published saying how critical race theory is harmful to Asians, when in fact, in the earliest days of critical race theory, Kimberly Crenshaw, the founder of the term intersectionality, an African-American woman who is at the forefront of that field, helped Asian Americans build out an analysis of how the ways that Asians were racialized in this country did harm to us and built barriers between us and other communities of color. When we get to learn the stories of our forebears, when we get to learn the stories of our ancestors, it equips us not just to survive a context that marginalizes, harms, and foreignizes us, it also robs us of the chance to connect with the people we are in shared struggle with. The one last thing I want to mention is I recognize my particular social context shapes the way that I engage this work. I'm South Asian. My father was Hindu. All of my family in India continue to be Hindu. And so my experience of Christianity is as a first generation on my father's side Christian. And any teachings I got not to connect with my ancestors came to me directly. The evangelical friends around me who were trying to save me and my father from our sinful ways. So it was not something that was taught to me by people from my racial context because it wasn't a generational experience. And I did hear the beep. Thank you, Dr. Lee. It was not a generational experience, for which I'm in some ways grateful, because it allows me to engage this question while the practice of connecting with ancestors is still very much alive in my family. And so that's what I'm going to leave with so that we can keep this conversation on time. But I want to thank the other people who are speaking for taking the time to read a paper, because in COVID times, I find it very hard to get through a full article, far less a paper. So God bless all of you for taking that time.
Thank you very much. Okay, well, we'll have Reverend Mangum begin the responses.
Sure. I want to thank you. I'm grateful to Dr. Lee and the Asian American Pacific Islander Studies program at Brite, my alma mater, for giving me the opportunity to participate in this year's colloquy. My understanding of the role of a respondent in endeavors like this is to offer some sort of critical first word to the presenting scholar. I'm not sure how useful I will be in that endeavor. I believe that Reverend Shanda is one of the most important voices, especially among disciples of Christ today. I don't usually seek to be critical. I usually just sit, listen, and say, amen, thanks be to God. I also know next to nothing about the practice of honoring one's ancestors. So I offer what is less a critique and more a set of curiosities with regard to this essay. The first curious question I would ask is, how might someone who regularly practices the veneration of ancestors assess Reverend Zha's characterization of the practice? Reverend Zha's goal is not to provide a cultural overview of an ancient religious practice. She approaches the subject intentionally as one invested in anti-racism work and as one seeking tools for the project of dismantling racism. The rejection of ancestor veneration among Asian Christians is a product of the ways white supremacy has infiltrated our assumptions about what is normative Christianity. And the retrieval of honoring our ancestors, their ancestors, can be a useful tool in the project of dismantling racism. If I be permitted to rely on Western European terminology, it seems that Reverend Zha has applied hermeneutics to a spiritual discipline of ancestor veneration. A hermeneutic of hospitality, to be sure, as retrieving the practice defies white hegemony, and within the practice, Asians can locate models of courage, perseverance, and resistance that fuel today's efforts. Yet also hermeneutic of suspicion, as people also encounter ancestors who perhaps retreat from conflict or rely on their own forms of privilege rather than the ones who stood in their respective gaps. Whenever I personally venture into the field of hermeneutics, I think about a caution given by Hebrew Bible scholar Ellen Davis, who said, anytime we pick up the Bible, read it, and say that's exactly what I thought, we're probably in trouble. I believe that the resources of our theology, like scripture, experience, tradition, spiritual disciplines, and in this case, filial veneration, offer the greatest gifts to us when we seek deep understanding of them on their own terms. So I wonder if the anti-racist goals of the project to dismantle white supremacy define the approach to filial veneration to the point where Reverend Zha has looked at her own ancestors and said, that's exactly what I thought. This curiosity was sparked for me by the repeated references to her in her essay to the way we learn and understand what we might gain through honoring our ancestors. As I read that, again, knowing nothing about the practice, I wondered if there weren't some more transcendent motivation that lies beneath filial veneration. Is the purpose of honoring one's ancestors to cultivate learning, understanding, and virtue, or is there something more? What very little research I did in this area consisted, for the most part, of reading a work that comes out of Confucianism, as best I understand it, the Shou King, or filial piety. And again, I'm admitting my utter lack of knowledge in this area. But what I understand of this work is that it was written as a primer for children as they learned to read, and they were learning to read about honoring their ancestors. And that soon concluded in reading that work that, in fact, that is what the purpose of filial veneration is to cultivate virtue. What I wrote in the margins of the paper as I was reading it was, to what extent does veneration of ancestors assume an open space between the living and the dead? That question could be dismissed as being rooted in assumptions I bring to the essay. It is certainly reflective of what I would want out of a spiritual discipline, is some connection to the transcendent, and maybe that's not embedded in that practice. Still, it's my curiosity. The second question I would raise is probably more a legitimate critique than it is a question, but I'll maintain my veneer of humility and ask the question anyway. Has Reverend Zha accurately characterized white culture? Reverend Zha seems to assert that white culture is nearly exclusively individualistic, and as such has not only unleashed acidic hegemony toward communalistic cultures, but has done damage to itself by not being appropriately nurtured through communal values. I have seen and heard this assertion before in anti-racism work, but I have not seen it adequately substantiated. I'm thinking specifically here of the assessment made by Alexis de Tocqueville, and also more recently by Robert Putnam, Robert Bella, and Robert Wuthnow, who substantiate values of communalism and social capital. Robert Bella especially argues that American values, I will say Anglo-American values, circa 1776, balanced both individualistic and communalistic virtues, and that loss of communalism occurred more recently as a response to anti-communist and anti-socialist Cold War mentalities. Admittedly, that happened before the Second World War, so it's been with us for 100 years of our 245 years history as a democracy. I still think it's significant to note that a few white male Protestants do believe that community matters. I don't really say that as trying to defend myself and my brethren against the charge of rabid individualism, but instead as preparation for my final curiosity I have around this essay, and that is whether Reverend Zhang has underanalyzed the political and geopolitical factors that may be at play in the filial veneration and its suppression with Asian Christians. White supremacy is not a self-contained social pathology. It functions within a geopolitical context. Reverend Zhang wrote that. Individualism, which erases communitarian ethic, is a hallmark of white supremacy culture. I don't think that Reverend Zhang intends to suggest that there are no communal aspects to white supremacy culture. In fact, her essay provides the analysis of how white supremacy serves the interests of British and American imperialistic interests. It was the foundation of Western European violence and enslavement of African people, genocide of Native American persons, and imperialism in Asia. Christian missionaries and denominations were guilty and are guilty of participating in this Western European and American hegemony and the mythologizing that white Christianity is the colorless, culturalist, normative form of Christianity. But what struck me in my brief survey of filial piety is that it seemed to perpetuate not only family virtues, but also national commitments and national identity. Seeking to erase filial devotion from Asian Christian practice may have had as much to do with clashes of national identity as it did with white ethnic bigotry. So again, those are honest questions. I'll end where I began, which is to say that I suspect these are not so much limitations of the essay as limitations of the context and the time that we have to do this sort of thing. And whatever answers Reverend Zhang would give to that, I will trust because I find her eminently trustworthy. So thank you for the opportunity to participate.
Thank you very much, Reverend Mangum. All right, we'll move on with our next respondent, Dr. David Chung.
Thank you. It is my true honor and joy to be able to have this crucial conversation with Reverend Sandhya, Shanda, Dr. Mangum, and Dr. Oredein, and the wider Brite community. I also appreciate the leadership of Dr. Lee and Chungsu, and for organizing this event and inviting me to share my humble insight. Today, I respond to Reverend Shanda Jha's fascinating article as a cisgender Asian American male who is a pastoral theologian and a longtime Presbyterian youth minister, by asking two specific questions. First, what does it mean to be an Asian American Christian in the age of COVID-19? Second, how do we connect with and rely on the spiritual wisdom of our ancestors in the face of a global pandemic, systemic racism, and xenophobia? Anti-Asian xenophobia and discriminatory acts against Asian Americans have increased significantly as the COVID-19 pandemic has rapidly spread across America. Since March 2020, at least 3,000 anti-Asian hate incidents have been reported and documented across the US. On March 11th, last Thursday, President Joe Biden publicly condemned anti-Asian hate crimes in a speech on pandemic recovery, powerfully noting quote, "It's wrong, it is un-American, and it must stop," unquote. Although the uptick of racism and violence amid this global pandemic is alarming, the association between disease, racism, xenophobia, and Asian American is not certainly new in US history. Yellow peril, which is a fear that Chinese and other Asian Americans are a threat to America and Western culture, has persisted in American history and culture since the 1890s. This fear that led to Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first race-based exclusion law in American history. Recently, with COVID-19, we can see how US society easily slips back into its worst pattern. The same yellow peril myth, language, and imagery are once again back in public discourse and media coverage to portray all people of Asia, people of Asian descent, as infested with disease, subjecting them to undue quarantine and interrogation. Seemingly in opposition to yellow peril, but also driven by structural anti-Asian racism, the model minority myth is another widespread stereotype that Asians in America are healthier, more hardworking, better educated, and more affluent than any other racial and ethnic groups. This model minority myth dangerously assumes that Asian Americans are monolithic, singularly highlighting the wealth, the health, and success of a selected few, and overlooks the wide range of inequality and disparities that exist in the larger Asian American communities. In many instances, Asian Americans have been known as model people in opposition to other communities of color. In other words, the lives of Asian Americans have for generations been under the shadow of these dually harmful, racist, and pervasive stereotypes, the yellow peril and the model minority. So what does it mean for Asian Americans in 2021 to be represented, stigmatized, and portrayed both as the yellow peril and model minority at the same time? What happens to the psychosocial and physical well-being of Asian Americans when they are forced to internalize these dually injurious racist stereotypes? For example, public health specialists have raised concern about how these stereotypes have negatively contributed to the Asian American COVID-19 disparities. Shaped by the yellow peril rhetoric, current xenophobic acts against Asian Americans are significant because racism is a potent social determinant of health, which can exacerbate health disparities already present in the Asian American communities. The report from the Federal Office of Minority Health describes Asian Americans as, quote, healthier than any other racial groups, unquote, corroborating the socially constructed view of Asian Americans from the 1960s as healthy, wealthy, and with a strong work ethic, the ultimate model minority. But the national report seriously neglects the underserved Asian American and many distinct Asian American populations, which today consist of more than 50 ethnic and 100 language groups. While the COVID-19 cases and deaths in areas with higher racial and ethnic minority groups continues to increase, particularly the underserved Asian American subgroups, such as those who are undocumented, low income, LGBTQIA+, elderly, children, and non-English speaking, have been detrimentally affected by this pandemic. While these subgroups have limited access to healthcare due to a high rate of uninsurance, most importantly, these individuals and communities are afraid to seek and receive healthcare precisely because of anti-Asian xenophobia and racism. Thus, for Asian Americans, we first must engage the work of what Dr. Park Hui-Lang calls decolonizing mind. We as Asian Americans need to begin decolonizing our mind by rethinking how we have uncritically internalized, relied on, and accepted these racist representations of ourselves in the US. In my own research and ministry with Korean American Christian youth and young adults, I have found that many of them often willingly embrace the model minority stereotype, partially motivated by the fact that the characterization of Asian Americans as a model and successful minority group seems positive and even flattering when compared with stereotypes of other racial minorities. This calls for the most urgent challenge for Asian American faith leaders, which is to guide and help our young people to realize that this uncritical acceptance and embrace of model minority will only reinforce the harmful cultural narrative that perpetually claim that white Americans are superior than any other racial groups. Especially as our youth and young adults attempt to live up to this model minority standards, they would censure and even silence their authentic experiences and voices. However, while we are still struggling to decolonize our mind, our young people of faith especially, have been already at the forefront of activism and community organizing in 2021, both on the ground and online, in response to the alarming escalation in racism, xenophobia, and bigotry as a result of COVID-19. One notable example is Stop AAPI, which stands for Asian American and Pacific Islander Hate Campaign, as many of us know. While this movement mainly serves as the main aggregator for anti-Asian hate incidents, but it also educates Asian Americans that in order to effectively address anti-Asian racism, we must work to end all forms of structural racism leveled at Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color. For another example, Asians for Black Lives is another leading organization that has been proactive in responding to a call from the larger Black Lives Matter movement since 2015. Started in America, but it has sprouted to the continents of Asia, composed of strikingly diverse group of Asian voices coming from the Philippines, India, China, Pakistan, Korea, Japan, and any other Asian nations. This trans-Pacific, transnational united action of Asian for Black Lives has demonstrated and exemplified their solidarity with Black people in their struggle for justice. In conclusion, going back to Reverend Ja's main question, how do we engage with the spiritual wisdom of our ancestors? I dare to say that many young Asian Americans have been already actively engaging the wisdom of our ancestors by following their footsteps. From the time of Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 to the internment of Japanese Americans and the civil rights movement, thousands of Asian American ministers, community leaders, railroad workers, and college students tirelessly engaged in the unnoticed struggle for their civil rights, struggling to raise their voices for immigration reform, land laws, hate crimes, and racial justice and equality. Of course, there is still much work to be done. Even in 2021, we lack proper political representation, immigration reform, healthcare access, and enforced voting rights. But we must first remember that our ancestors have taken down mountains. And also, we must remember that our Black and Brown communities have paved the way for our own resistance throughout history. Therefore, it is our great responsibility and call, especially for people of faith, to undertake and expand the work that our ancestors have begun. The honorable and sacred work for all of us to be recognized as Americans with our own unique voices and histories. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zhou. And our final respondent is Dr. Oredein.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lee, Dr. Cho, Dr. Mangum. It is a pleasure to be on a panel with you. Dr. Shanda, pleasure to read your work and to engage it. Heads up for everybody watching over here, might be a dog. If he pops up, don't worry about it. I know he exists. So just a heads up. Okay, let's jump right in. Reverend Shanda has me thinking in two directions. First, about creative possibilities, and second, about embrace. So first, creative possibilities. My family came to the States when I was young. So in many ways, I think how I feel, which is in liminality. Children of immigrants know belonging as well as distance all too well. They also know that there needs to be another option. I think children of immigrants to be unique agents of ethnogenesis. They literally occupy a space in life where they create new culture and ways of being through interrogating and examining where culture they have been given meet who they are and what new directions and ways of being make themselves clear towards who they want to be. An anthropological concept, ethnogenesis, a means of cultural persistence by in-moment reimagining and remaking, is a helpful lens in processing the message and impact of what Reverend Zhang offers us here. It, in my interpretation, requires questions and honest answers. It does not shy away from questioning elders and ancestral ideations, but interviews their intentions and considers what is true of and for them based on this information and subsequent practices. It honors the ancestral and traditional without worshiping their choices of living as perfect. Tradition is guidance, ancestors instructive guides. Ethnogenesis does not enter into tradition with hyper-loyal faith, but decides for itself what tradition in the present moment should look like in order to honor the spectrum of human life within a said people, group, tribe, or culture. It finds a way to continue a culture while accounting for its evolution and change. New modes of culture and relationality emerge as a result because those who engage in ethnogenesis never pretend their people's questions remain the same across time. But most importantly, they consider themselves integral to the continuum of their people's life. They count themselves in the story, in the narrative of what questions matter to their community's existence. This is important. This, in many ways, is what Reverend Zhang is demonstrating in her beautiful paper, in her beautiful reflection. Counting one's self in the story is a means of recognizing the fullness of one's people, that people are people with or without being enveloped in a representative brand of colonial Christianity, that people must not be diminished because they do not follow a Western mold of the status quo wisely disguised as Christian spirituality. Children of immigrants know both the pain and liminality of not fully belonging to native culture or new cultures, but they're also in a rare position to ask questions that their bodies have literally taught them to ask, that they would not know to lift up otherwise unless they had experienced that something was wrong and not asking these questions, no matter how difficult they are. These descendants bring their ancestors with them and invite new ways to consider what different facets of one's identity means. In this, the notion of possession, ownership, and claim capture the imagination. Reverend Zhang does this in her wondering around culture and faith. Does faith own the culture, or does the culture own the faith? And further, what do we do with the Christian's faith multi-forms? So a few thoughts on embrace. Reverend Zhang's paper invites us into these questions in a really dynamic way. She lets us into the thinking mind of culture creators who identify the hard realities of holding on to the past while adjusting their living to the present. The past holds so much. If we slow it down, we get the larger message. The past, at its core, literally holds. It's best not to rush past this. We see through Reverend Jha's work that if what people were and who their descendants are seem to be at war, especially concerning clashes with culture and Christianity, the fight may not necessarily be in completely altered cultural values, but a reaction to hostile environments. In other words, the tension of who one is, culture, and whose one is, Christianity, may have little to do with contrasting values and more to do with how each of them holds. Culture, no doubt, holds the strongest, holds the tightest. It casts its light onto Christianity, determining its forms and importance to particular peoples. They're not Christian first. They are white Christians, or Nigerian Christians, or Korean Christians, or Indian Hindu Christians. Culture comes first. But the tension Reverend Zhang lifts up for us is the invisible modifier, one that a student taught me a long time ago, that sits in front of the moniker Christian. If one comes from a colonized country or has inherited Christianity, the modifier white most likely lives in front of it. This is the battle. This is the tension. Not necessarily ancestral practices, nor the heart of Christianity itself, but one's body, one's people trying to hold dueling cultures. One's non-white Christian ancestors likely wrestled with this. I see this literally in my grandmother or my mother trying to uphold a cultural belief or superstition while at the same time seriously rejecting it as pagan ritual. They literally are warring right in front of me in their dual identities and in these dual cultures. Zha helps us hone in on a unique problem. Christianity, though imperfect in its expressions in many ways, is not the culprit under interrogation. Though some try to disguise it as such, the children of immigrants or first-generation immigrants themselves are feeling the shockwaves of cultural conflict. This is what ancestors may be trying to tell. Colonialism disguises himself well. All cultures are vying for preservation. Do not surrender who you are for who they want you to be. They're only trying to grow in numbers, influence, and longevity, and they will use Christianity to do so. If it seems I veered from Reverend Zha's reflective points, in some ways I did. But that's primarily because she's opened up the door for us to hear her captivating work and reflect on the tensive pulls that are happening within us when we sense somebody is disagreeing with our Christianity. Is it our Christianity or is it our culture? A culture that if we surrender 1 ounce of, we fear and risk disappearing entirely. So some conclusive thoughts. I started off my reflections here with ethnogenesis. Now, why in the world would I do that? Because no matter its creative intentions, ethnogenesis is a practice of cultural preservation. It is a means of ensuring that even those who experience a liminal life will not be erased or forgotten. To be clear, this is not a bad thing. In fact, it's a much needed thing. But I think the better term for those of us who are Christian to consider would be something more akin to, a liberative ecclesiogenesis, where the point of preservation is diluted into a collective community understanding of a church self cognizant of and honoring towards the world around it, a church self that understands it only exists because of the internet-connected grace of creation. And how I'm thinking with it, liberative ecclesiogenesis humbles preservationist attitudes and asks honest questions about what community is supposed to entail and what it could be. It knows Christianity is a faith tradition that not only relies heavily on ancestral wisdom itself, but is not afraid to welcome the modern movement into its function, for it counts everyone as critical to the life of the people, of the body. The ancestors still hold and cling to those of us who identify as blank Christian. As a collective, but still highly aware of and honorific towards our particularities as well as points of commonality. This is what I wonder. Can we begin to feel this hold, whether it's cultural or Christian, not as possessive, but this hold of the ancestors? Can we begin to feel this as an embrace? Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Oredein. Okay, and we now have time for Reverend Zhang to respond to the responders, and responders have done an excellent job keeping within the time limit. So she does have 5 to 10 minutes. Go ahead.
I'll do my best, and my understanding is people are
That's
welcome
right.
to provide Q&A at this point as
Absolutely.
well. So
Mhm.
that's, yeah, please do send in your questions while I'm briefly talking. I was really grateful. The last time I shared an academic paper, or a paper in this wasn't an academic paper, but a paper in an academic setting, was in front of Melissa Harris Perry, who was the director of a program of politics and religion at Chicago, and she eviscerated my paper. You all were so much more generous. Thank you so much. It meant a lot. And you gave me a lot to incorporate into the work, because you're catching this at the very beginning of my thinking. And what each of you offered was so helpful. So I can't thank you enough for that. Dr. Mangum, I found myself thinking because you had some great reflections, and I found myself thinking of back in 9th grade, I got invited into an evangelical Bible study, and it was all white except for me. And they invited me because I love Jesus. He's been my best friend since I was 3 years old. And I remember one of them coming in from listening to Christian radio in her car, and she said, I was just sobbing because there was a story of a Chinese man who had converted to Christianity, and he went up to the Billy Graham Foundation evangelist, sobbing. And the man said, why are you so sad when you've been saved? And he said, because I couldn't save my ancestors. And this notion of unsalvageable ancestors baked into a version of Christianity has haunted me, I think, since that moment. And the questions you raised were so helpful in helping me refine how I think about that. So I wanted to thank you for bringing up some of the questions you did and causing me to revisit a memory that's been just burned into my brain since that point in time. Dr. Cho, I was so grateful for you lifting up the fact that some of the young adult leaders within the Asian American Christian community are honoring our ancestors. I'm much more likely to find a young person who knows who Grace Lee Boggs or Yuri Kochiyama is than somebody my age. And I was so grateful for you saying, they're honoring those ancestors by following in their footsteps. I really, really appreciated you lifting that up. And Dr. Oredein, I was so moved by your reflections on ethnogenesis, the conversations I've been having with my Hindu colleagues, many of whom have abandoned Hinduism as uniquely unsalvageable. I've been trying to invite us to go back and look at some of our original texts and say, whose stories are hidden in these texts? Because there are Dalit contributions to Hinduism. There are contributions of women to Hinduism. There are stories right in the texts of queer and trans Hindu people and even deities. And because we are placing ourselves in the story, it gives us the ability to see some of those hidden stories that some of our ancestors who weren't served by those stories wouldn't have pointed out. And so I really appreciate what you're lifting up, because while it does hold that tension of Christianity and culture, it also connects to culture and religion in the broader sense. So I was really grateful for you lifting that up. So all of your reflections have been so helpful to me in thinking this through, and makes me eager for more of this kind of conversation, because I think there is something liberative about what all of you have brought up in terms of what can be transcendent, what can ground us in the concrete lived experiences of our people right now, and what can help us make sense of that liminal experience that sometimes feels like a disadvantage, but is also an opportunity to allow us to be in deeper relationship with each other and with those who came before.
Thank you very much. And I don't see any question or comment on our chat or Q&A. So those of us who are in the audience, you are welcome to send in your comments. Meanwhile, I'll just open it up among the panelists. If you have any particular response to Reverend John's response to your responses or anything else to share, it'd be great to have them. I wonder, Reverend John, what you think about the phenomenon of Christian and nationalism, the way Christianity, gets embedded within a particular group of people, and for them, somehow Christianity is the bedrock of their identity, and of course, they're talking about a particular version of Christianity. So how do you negotiate that as someone who's open to pluralism? And I think it's an issue for us because pluralists are supposedly at least open to hearing views of people who are different. So I like people who are fundamentalistically nationalistic about a religion really seems to not to be prone to any kind of conversation.
No, and I think it's a great question, and I'd love to hear other panelists' reflections on that question as well. I'm particularly interested in it because I was just thinking about that passage from, I think it's 1 Peter, that says, once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. And that notion, which is spoken to a liminal group, right, is spoken to a group that has felt disconnected from their family of origin, their Jewish family, and is trying to find a way forward in a different kind of identity. And so this notion of once you were not a people isn't necessarily true. They were of a people, but they, because of their beliefs, their practices, because they're trying to pick fights, for whatever reasons, they are not of that people anymore. And so I think there is something endemic to, the earliest version of Christianity that was a little bit allergic to nationalism. It was supposed to be, I think, something that demanded that we transcend those nation-state alliances. And yet, that didn't mean it was a cultureless religion. It meant it was a religion shaped by multiple cultures. I also, and I don't think that this is a necessarily useful way to think about things, but I do find the fact that if that is true, then anytime Christianity is reaching majority status, every time it is becoming baked into a nation's culture, it is somehow being done wrong. I don't think that was ever what Christianity was supposed to look like. And admittedly, that means we've been doing it wrong for about 1600 years in various forms. And I think that that's something we have to wrestle with.
So would that be something like idolatry? And I mean, that would be something like Karl Barth or Dietrich Bonhoeffer critiqued, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And it does tie into what Dr. Mangum was saying earlier about anytime we look at the text and say, that's exactly what I thought, I think that can be done on the national scale as well, that it can become a dangerously self-confirming way of approaching faith.
Right, great. We have a couple of comments here. One, Many thanks from Dr. Stephen Sprinkle. Many thanks to Reverend Zhang and our panelists for a stimulating, challenging set of questions. As a cisgender white man, I find this conversation especially helpful in interrogating my own presumptions. Thank you, Dr. Sprinkle. And a question from Dr. Joretta Marshall. I wonder if Dr. Oredein and Reverend Zhang could say a bit more about embrace, as Dr. Oredein pointed forward. Either of you.
I'm happy to defer.
Please.
But I'm happy to
No, please go ahead.
I kind of threw it out there. When I was reading your paper, I just kept thinking what to name this tension and this resistance and whatever it's characterized as. And I likened it to a very tight embrace, a very tight hug. And one's ancestors embracing them tightly, and Christianity cultured in white supremacy is trying to rip this person away from their ancestors. But what would it look like to realize, oh, I'm not in a war, I'm in an embrace, and I need to sort out how this feels and how this contributes to who I am. That's kind of the imagery that I was trying to work with. So Reverend Zhang, I know it's putting you on the spot to potentially attend to this question, but that was kind of the imagery that I was thinking. Instead of a war and tension, what if what's happening is an embrace?
Yeah, and I love that. And I think it ties a little bit to another question that came in, which was, how do we navigate the issue of romanticizing the past? Because I think kind of well, not just implicit, in some ways explicit in what you were reflecting on. Part of that, and I think of it as a dance, but I like embrace as well, is needing to interrogate. In fact, one of my colleagues talks about how some of our work of connecting with ancestors is helping them become better ancestors. Because sometimes the work was about surviving, and the choice of surviving didn't always allow our ancestors to do great and glorious healing work. And some of our work is to look back and say, here's what they did with what they had. What can we learn from that? That's sometimes even a cautionary tale. Where did they leverage privilege and leave others behind? Where did they, where do we want to honor that they were facing impossible choices? And so some of that work, I think, is related to that embrace is owning that those are our folks in all of their imperfections, and that we have wisdom to learn from them as well. And some of it is creating space for them to be better ancestors, and for us to be better ancestors to the people who come after us. Sorry, go ahead.
No, right. Like, is the embrace too tight? Like, how does this embrace feel? Are they embracing too tightly? Does this feel just right? So yes, all of that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Go ahead, Dr. David. Joe, you had a...
Yeah, I think just that honoring and understanding and embracing the difficult past of our ancestors and our parents. And I just want to echo how difficult and painful that can be for a lot of children of immigrants, because what happened to them often in the US is that these role reversals, right? Children of immigrants, they learn to become adults, right? Because of they have to take the responsibilities of their parents because they are more eloquent in English, because they can navigate American culture better. So that's what I see often in a lot of struggles in immigrant families. The challenge of embracing just our parents, our imperfect parents who did their best, who made hard choices for us, but at times for the immigrant children, it takes a lot. It takes a lot for a long time for them to fully understand and make sense of the choices that their parents had made, and the lack of time they had to give up to support their family and survive in America. So yes, it is embraced, but that takes time. Yeah, that takes time.
Thank you very much. It's 2 o'clock. You've all done wonderful, not only in terms of exchanging insightful ideas, but keeping time. And I think this message from Dr. Marshall sums it up very well. Thank you all for this great conversation. Thank you, Dr. Joe, Dr. Oredein, Dr. Mangum, and especially Dr. Shanda. Thank you very much.
So
And
grateful.
so we are done with our colloquy, but our Asian and Asian American Pacific Islander Church Studies program continues tomorrow at 11 o'clock. We have chapel, and there are links to it at our Brite website, and Dr. Reverend Zhang will be preaching. So we welcome you to be part of that. Thank you very much.